Last time we talked about a bit more about the pastoral side of this. Today is going to be about the theological and philosophical underpinnings of our view of death and dying. Okay? Again, remember where we're headed with this is to help us walk with families through the end of life, particularly when it involves making decisions about stopping treatments, stopping life support, stopping feeding tubes, right? Those kinds of decisions that families feel, on the whole, feel pretty dazed and confused about making. All right? Now first, before we get to this, let's be clear about what constitutes life support. That we would have to make decisions about whether to turn off or whether to start in the first place. What are some of those? Mechanical ventilation is probably one of the primary ones. And just so you're aware, mechanical ventilation is not an all or nothing thing. I mean, people can be on mechanical ventilation and still, and be receiving only 50% oxygen, for example. And that's how typically they will wean someone off mechanical ventilation, and then they'll finally pull the tubes. Okay, what else? Feeding tubes. Okay. Now there's some discussion about whether that's a different category or not, which we'll get to later today. Okay, what else? That's it? What about CPR? Is generally considered a life support. Okay? And just so you're aware, CPR was not designed for people who are in chronic conditions and failing health. CPR was designed if you, who I take it are otherwise robust and healthy, if your heart stops in the next few minutes, we can restart it. But if they had tried CPR on my father-in-law, anytime probably within the last year before he died, they would have broken ribs and probably punctured one of his lungs. And it's CPR, if you've ever seen it done, is not very pretty. Okay? Dialysis is also considered a life-sustaining treatment. Because if you're in renal failure and you don't have dialysis done, you'll probably die within a week. Okay? There are certain blood pressure medications that are also considered a life-sustaining treatment. Some people who have chronic heart problems need regular medication to keep their blood pressure up. Okay? Those are generally what are considered the most common life-sustaining treatments. Though technically, you might have to make decisions about stopping or starting a wide variety of treatments, including various forms of chemotherapy. You could even probably have to make decisions about whether to institute antibiotics at some point. Take, for example, a person who has terminal lung cancer and they get pneumonia. Okay? You could probably make a fairly good argument that antibiotics to treat the pneumonia would not necessarily be required. And if you treated the pneumonia, you could easily find yourself in a position of curing pneumonia so that they can die of lung cancer. And then you raise the question, well, we're treating this, but to what end? Or what's the goal, like we mentioned last time? Okay, so we're all clear about that? All right, now.
You mentioned chemotherapy.
Right. So this other types, and you might have to make this. We had to make this decision about surgery for my dad at 81. My father-in-law broke his hip about 3 months before he died. that's a huge surgery to fix that. But you can't, I mean, you almost can't not fix something like a fractured hip. So decisions about surgery, you know, I mean, there are some people who just say, no, I'm done. And we'll talk about how consistent that is with a distinctly biblical worldview. Okay? Now, turning to that worldview for a moment, I'd say this shouldn't be breaking news to any of you. Right? But the broad, general biblical principles on this seem fairly clear. Human life is God's sacred gift by virtue of being made in God's image. Therefore, innocent life is not to be taken. And there's as we've seen already, a huge obligation in the Scripture to protect the most vulnerable among us. And the elderly have always been considered among the most vulnerable, and even more so with the advent of the kind of end-of-life medicine that we have available. In biblical times, you didn't live with chronic conditions. I mean, if you had congestive heart failure, you died. There was no way to manage that. If you had, terminal lung cancer, I mean, you didn't treat that. There really wasn't even anything to keep people comfortable. You just died. Today, with medicine's ability to keep people alive in increasingly poor quality of life circumstances, we have created essentially a newer class of very vulnerable people in our culture. And the great fear today is not so much that you would die a painful death in a hospital, though that's still a very real fear. The huge fear today is that medicine will keep your body going long after your mind has given out. And so we would, though we would still technically be full persons with less mental capacity, it sure seems like that in that situation we become sort of a shell of a person. That's the one, then sort of the next thing to watch out for. Okay, now to be a little more specific when it comes to death and dying, originally, before the fall, death and dying was not a part of God's original design, right? And the reason that Adam and Eve were banished from the garden after the fall is so that they would not eat from the tree of life and live forever in a fallen condition, unredeemed. But from the start, the Bible is very clear that death came into the world as a result of the general entrance of sin. I would say with that came decay, disease, and dying process. Now, on the other hand, or maybe to balance that out, death is also seen in the Scripture as a normal, natural part of life under the sun, or as I take under the sun to be this side of eternity. Okay? And the reason that it is, or we'll put it this way, that both of this statement and these can go together, the reason for that is because of the pervasiveness and universality of sin. Right? The reason that death and dying is considered a normal, natural part of life that everybody is subject to is because of the pervasiveness of the impact of sin. But the idea that human beings would experience disease, death, and decay was not a part of God's original design. This is why we ought to, the idea of death with dignity ought to raise your antenna a bit. Because theologically speaking, I think we'd have to conclude that death is the ultimate indignity, is the ultimate, it's as far as the reach of sin can extend. And just, practically, if you've ever walked with somebody through a terminal illness, for example, toward dying, there's nothing particularly dignified about the dying process. The dignity in dying comes from where? It's ultimately by God's grace, but where we see dignity manifested is in how the person responds to the deterioration of his or her quality of life and the loss of control that often results. So I'd be a little bit careful about the way we throw around that term, death with dignity. And in a lot of the medical community, particularly the pro-assisted suicide community, this statement is often made to insist that death and dying is something that's morally neutral. But theologically, that's not true. That death is both, we would say, both an enemy and a normal, natural part of life. And I would say to the proponents of assisted suicide, I would say there's nothing particularly dignified about taking an end run around the dying process. So that and that's what I consider to be, in most cases, assisted suicide and euthanasia to be an end run. But the dignity in dying comes with how someone maintains themselves, how they maintain their faith, how they maintain their dignity by the way they walk through that. All right, does that make you with me on that? Okay. Any questions you want to raise on that? Now, thankfully, this is not the end of the story, because the Bible is also very clear that death has been conquered by the death and resurrection of Jesus. Right? Now, what I'm interested in for our discussion today is what follows from that. Okay, again, I'm hopeful that none of this is actually breaking news to you guys. But what follows, the implications of that, I think are things that we don't often give a lot of attention to. And I think are very profound for how we treat death and dying. Because if death is a conquered enemy, it seems to me that it need not always be resisted. So that under the right conditions, under the right, in the right set of circumstances, of course, because there are lots of times when we resist death vigorously, right? Amen? Okay. Just checking to make sure you're still awake. This idea that, excuse me, doctor, do everything, at some point is an inappropriate request. Right? Now, we have to think really carefully about what the criteria are for that, because I'd say most of the time, we ought to aggressively resist death, disease, and decay. But when the prognosis for a patient is very poor, and further treatment is either futile or God forbid, harmful, then we not only can, but there are times when we ought to say, stop to medicine. Probably 6 months before he died, I told my dad, at any time you can say enough. He was on his third different regimen of chemotherapy, each one more nastier than the one before. And it was killing him far faster than it was killing the cancer. And he sort of had that look that, you know, I don't want to quit fighting. I really don't want to live this way. And most, you know, you'd be surprised how frequently patients and our loved ones make very rational decisions about this. That, you know, again, if the prognosis is not great, and or let's put it this way, if the prognosis is not great, our loved ones often intuitively, they may not be able to verbalize it, but intuitively, they're calculating the costs and benefits. And not financial. They're calculating what this is doing to them. And actually saying enough, under the right circumstance, can be a very rational, logical decision to make. The problem is that either the family is not paying attention to that, or the family won't let go of their loved one. The family won't allow medicine to stop. We have a term for this we use frequently when dealing with families like this. When the medical treatment was not really helping the patient, but the doctors were doing it because the family was insistent, we would often say, we are now treating the family. And I think in most cases, treating the family is wrong. Because we're imposing burdens on your loved one for somebody else's benefit. This is why you guys can be so helpful in this, getting families to see theologically that it's okay to stop. Okay, hold on just a second. Now, I know some of you guys are in cultures where this is really hard to do. And what we would often say to families from different Asian cultures that we could tell were having huge difficulty with this is that the family often felt like the only thing they could do to show sort of proper respect and loyalty to, you know, their dad or their grandfather or whoever was to do everything medically possible until medicine just sort of threw up its hands and said, we're done. Okay? What we would often say to families is that we can actually do more to benefit your loved one by doing less medically. And we would try really hard never to promise that we will do everything. And if somebody asks you if you want everything done, you should rebuke them for asking you the wrong question. That's a terrible question. Because I mean, who's going to say no to that? I mean, nobody's going to say no. I don't want everything done for my mom. No, nobody's going to say no to that. Right? We promise that we'll do everything that's appropriate or everything to keep him comfortable. But see, if I were making the rules and families were wanting, you know, all sorts of treatment that was unwarranted, I would actually say, okay. But put a condition on it that you have to be at the bedside, observing what you are authorizing me as the physician to do to this person who you claim that you love. Because family members, they make decisions, but then where do they go? I mean, they either go home, or they go in the waiting room, or they go, across the street for dinner. Most families don't have a clue what they are authorizing to be done to their loved ones. And we've had nurses in the past come to the ethics committee with the question, literally, why are we torturing this poor person? Please don't be in the position where you are authorizing the torture of your loved ones because you can't let go of them. That's immoral to do that. You with me on that? Now, that's why I say at the end, making what's left of life more burdensome, more burdensome for a person is wrong. Now, the illness is going to do that to the person. Don't compound it. Right? We had one of the most jarring cases, which was an example of this kind of torture of a loved one, was this an 88-year-old man who was at the end stage of stomach colon cancer. And he couldn't have weighed more than 88 pounds. In fact, the family was asking that he be prepped for a colonoscopy for one last round of treatment. And that's exactly what the nurses said. In fact, I think you could have, if you would have held him up to a strong light, you probably could have gotten the same information. But the nurses came to the ethics committee and said, this is torture. This makes no sense. Right? But the reason was that the family was insistent on going forward. And they had stopped treating this patient a long time ago. And that's why I say, again, making what is left of life net more burdensome for our loved ones, I think is clearly wrong. And that's a situation where we are not only allowed to say stop to medicine, we ought to say stop when the burdens far outweigh the benefits. Okay? But here's what happens to families is they'll hear that there's this much possibility of benefit. And they'll run hard with that. And they'll think, well, maybe he's going to get better. But what they don't tell you is, this probability that he's going to continue to go downhill. And this probability that medicine won't do anything more for the person. Okay? So just, again, this is where you guys can be really helpful ministering to the families here, because you know them, and sometimes if you introduce to them the idea that it's okay to stop at at a point, the physicians, they will rise up and call you blessed for stepping in and helping them with that. Right? Now, I want to, some of you who face cultural obstacles to this, what would that be like to introduce that component? Not to say you ought to stop, but just to say, you don't have to do everything at all costs. What would that look like? Some of you guys that have expressed, cultural obstacles to this.
That's really difficult to do.
Okay, good. I'm glad you brought that up.
How they see it, that this is our way of helping.
Okay.
And for a Christian family, I think it would be good to remind them, because they might have known that, but when they're caught in emotion and
okay,
dealing with all that.
Very good. Okay. All right? So what do we say to the person who said, we got to keep everything going for one last, chance? Okay? One, I think, what makes that a tough question is if their loved one's not conscious. Then you've got your hands full with that. But I would say, what I tell people who bring up that point is I say, it's okay to keep the person on life support, to give another opportunity to respond to the gospel. But get to it. I'm going to do it today. Okay? And I'd say, even if they're not conscious, I would hold, not that you're dying, of course, but I would hold their hand and give it to them straight and pray for them and ask them to respond if they can. And then your job is done. And you trust God with the rest of it. And do what's medically what you ought to do. Right? And there, I bet you have some family members who, if they're conscious, will say, I don't want to hear it. Right? A really dear friend of ours whose dad was dying, and he said, don't talk to me about Jesus. He said, I'm not interested. And it was killing his daughter. And so I suggested to her to frame it in terms of, getting closure for me. I need to say this. This is part of what I need to say to you to get closure on your dying. Right? So I just said, ask him to humor you on this. And tell him some other things that you want to be sure and tell him. But also tell him, I'd really like to spend eternity with you too. Okay? Now for the Christian family, you can be a little more blunt. And I would say to the Christian family, I would say, why are you delaying this person's homecoming? What on earth are you doing? Again, this is if the prognosis is very poor. This is when the person is, headed downhill. Seriously downhill. That's what we mean when we say that further treatment is futile. That means that there's nothing medicine can do to stop this imminent, irreversible downward spiral. Right? Now, you can have, you might have, a little upticks, like if antibiotics can cure pneumonia. But the overall situation is going seriously downhill. And that's why I encouraged you last time to have the family make sure they get it clear about what the prognosis is and what the goal for the care for their loved one is. And then you got to make sure that the prognosis and the goal are consistent. How many of you have been around family members who are in denial about the end of life? It's very common. Right? And part of your important role as pastors is to help them shake that denial. All right? Well, amen? Okay. So under these conditions, it's okay to say stop. When a competent adult requests it, which means, I remember we talked about competence last time, which means they're capable of making their own decisions. Right? So under the law, when a competent adult says to stop, you have to. Right? Because in California, I don't know how in other states, but in California, if you administer an invasive treatment over somebody's competent objection, you've committed battery. And physicians are thankfully reluctant to go to jail for battery. Okay. Now, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, a competent patient will say enough when the treatment is futile or when the burden outweighs the benefit. Most treatments are not technically futile. Most treatments offer some benefit, however small. At the end of life, a lot of treatments, the benefit is clearly outweighed by the burden. Now, we can, maybe for another time, we can have a very interesting discussion about what should count as the burden. Okay? Whether money should count as a burden. Okay? Typically, we viewed this a little more narrowly, and it's only the physical, medical burdens that count in this calculation. Okay? I'm not so sure, but what we ought to count the burden on the family as part of this. Clearly not that would have the trump card. And I don't think we should be calling that an obligation. I think it's a little strong. But let me give you an example. Let's say that my dad wanted to go for one last sort of ditch experimental treatment that Medicare wouldn't cover, the supplemental insurance wouldn't cover, and would have essentially wiped out my mom. I mean, let's say it would have cost, $300,000 to do this. That would have put a serious hurt on my mom going forward after his death. I don't think there's any doubt that my dad would have foregone that treatment because of the burden it would have put on my mom following his death. And let's say, God forbid that something happened to me and, and our insurance, ran out or didn't cover it, and, I was left with the option of continuing treatment, but at a cost that would clearly jeopardize my family's ability to go forward after I'm gone. I'd think really hard about saying no to that. Because we do something really odd at the end of life that we don't do, I don't think, in hardly any other scenarios. Most of the time, the way families operate is in fact, I'm desperately trying to teach my teenagers this, is that we balance the interest of the family as a whole with the interest of the individual members, right? So it's always a balancing act. But when somebody gets seriously ill, that balancing act goes out the window, right? And then it's the interest of that seriously ill person now have trump card status. And it's as though everybody else becomes invisible. In my view, there's something not quite right with that picture. Right? Now, of course, the vulnerability of the seriously ill person, I think, weights their interests, raises the weighting of their interests. But I'm uneasy saying that we should only look to just the medical interests of the person. Maybe it would be best to put it something like this, that we would see this, to say no to a treatment that would impose crushing burdens on my family we'd see this as a virtuous thing. I'm not sure I want to say that I'm obligated to do that. You understand why that is? Because that then gives my family a claim on me to exercise my obligation. And that having a claim on me to do that, I think, is inconsistent with having the right to life. Are you with me on that? That clear as mud? I'll take that as a yes. Okay. So anyway, I think there's probably something to think about here to maybe expanding our definition of those burdens more than we commonly do. I think there's something to that. Okay. Do you have a question about this?
Just the trickiness of a competent patient. There's all kinds of things that go on in people's minds.
Well,
because we're making assessments.
That's right.
We're trying to hear the doctor, and you're just assuming a lot of stuff.
You are. But here's what I mean is a legally competent patient. And what the legal definition, there are only a handful of things that can render you incompetent legally. And that's unconsciousness, sedation, and severe pain. Now, you probably also put dementia in that category. But you'd be surprised, I think. People with dementia often have periods of lucidity. I mean, what do they call those? The sunset periods, or I forget what they call it. But they sort of come in and out of being with the program. And I would say you always default to asking the person what their wishes are. I mean, that's always the default position. If they're not capable of making decisions for themselves, then the family steps in. But remember, we said last time, the family's role is to represent their best guesstimate at what their wishes are. And that's why if you have something in writing to go on, it's an immense help in that regard. All right? So again, we often tell families, what do you want done? And that's the wrong question. The question is, what do you think your loved one would want done? Okay? And often that's a very revealing question that if we ask it, in fact, as pastors, we routinely ask families to say, if your dad or your grandfather could speak for himself, what would he want here? And to be honest about that. Because that can be a very helpful question to raise to get those wishes on the table. Here's what I want to make sure we touch on. Okay? These are what I would consider to be some of the most common objections to what we have just said, that it's okay to say enough. Right? So commonly we say, is this playing God? What do you say to that? Yes or no? Is turning off life support playing God? No, why not? That's exactly right. All right. Okay. You're actually turning it over to God. I think you can make a good argument that playing God and delaying somebody's homecoming is done by keeping them on life support. Playing God, what we mean by that is usurping a prerogative that belongs to God alone. Now, what this does actually is this objection sort of begs this question, right? Because if removing life support is killing your loved one, then we got a serious problem, because God has mandated that we not kill innocents. So this one really revolves around our answer to the second one. Right? And here's the tricky part of this, is that this feels to family members like they're killing their loved ones when they turn off life support. Because, you know, if dear old dad here is on mechanical ventilation and he's essentially, you know, has very little brain activity, or is imminently dying, and we elect correctly to remove the ventilator, we'll make that decision. They'll pull out the tube, and usually within 30 to 60 minutes, he's gone. And that, I mean, the way the time works sometimes makes it really hard to avoid that feeling that I've contributed to killing my dad. Right? This is where you have to help families with this, because you need to educate their conscience and their intuitions on this. Because theologically and philosophically, that's not what you've done. What you have done is you have removed all the impediments and allowed dad or mom or grandpa's disease to take its natural course. There is a big moral difference between killing and allowing to die. And thankfully, the Supreme Court recognized that too in their deliberations on assisted suicide. Okay? So it's the disease that kills the patient. Right? When we turn off life support, what you die from, sorry to focus on this, but what you will die from, no, I don't know about that, but is the underlying disease or condition. Right? So it's lung cancer that's killed you, not our decision to turn off life support. Right? It's really important to help you get families over that. That's a big hurdle for some families to get over. We all clear on that? Okay. Neither, in the case of feeding tubes, is removing feeding tubes starving someone to death for exactly the same reason. Okay? Now, it's a little bit tough, it's a little trickier with this, because one of the things that contributes to a patient dying when a feeding tube is removed is dehydration. So it looks a little bit more like the cause and effect. Like pulling these tubes has actually caused the dehydration. But if you go back a step, and you go back to the underlying disease or condition that is preventing this person from taking food and water by mouth, right, which is either a stroke or some form of dementia or a vegetative state, coma. I mean, it's just very common when people at the end of life, people at the end stage Alzheimer's, will lose their ability to swallow. They're also well known for trying to pull out their feeding tubes. Sorry?
With removing life support causes great pain. If the patient is still, he's not unconscious, he's not in vegetative state.
Okay, that's a good question. Can removing feeding tubes, particularly what you're referring to, cause pain? Yes, if it's not controlled. Now, you almost always, when feeding tubes are removed, they will also give fairly heavy conscious sedation so that the pain is not experienced. Okay? Now, even if it's a good question you raise, because even if we control someone's pain, we still owe them what I would call dignity care at the end of life. And that would involve, for a person in vegetative state, for example, that would involve putting ice chips on their lips and keeping their face hydrated, just paying attention to them as they go through that final stage. All right, but that's a good question. And even when when a ventilator's removed, usually they are fairly heavily sedated so they don't experience the shortness of breath that comes with the removal of that. Okay? And I say it is almost always unethical not to adequately treat someone's pain at the end of life. And the good news is that in virtually every case we can, short of killing them. But I'm glad you raised the question.
Dr. Ray,
yes.
In terms of the pain question, is hospice care, can they still give that kind of, helping with pain?
Hospice, that's what they do. Right? And nobody does that better. In fact, stop me if I mentioned this last time, but all of you should know, if you minister in a local church, you should all have at your fingertips or in your address book the 2 or 3 hospice references that you can make. And for around here, the St. Joseph's of Orange health system has a world-class hospice ministry. And most hospice today is done in the home. So they'll come to you. In fact, I've decided, hospice nurses they're some of my new heroes after watching them treat my dad. Okay. Now, did we talk about Terry Schiavo at all? Yeah, enough? Okay. Yeah. We missed the point of this. The big picture question got obscured by the question of what her wishes were. And if she'd written any of this stuff down, this wouldn't have come. Anyway, any questions on this? Okay. This is the big one. Is we say, well, how can you be pro-life and turn off ventilator support and remove feeding tubes? So you're just being a hypocrite. Right? I was actually called that by somebody claiming to be a pro-life supporter. And the response to that, depending on how much mustard came with the question, the response to that is, I would say, if the question came with a lot of mustard, I would say, why are you guilty of idolatry? You with me on that? Be really careful with this. To equate the sanctity of life with an obligation to do everything at all times, at all costs, is idolatry. Right? Because if you think about it, if we say that we are obligated to treat everyone to the max at all times, at all costs, and I think we're making a theological statement about earthly life that I'd bet my last buck you don't want to make. Right? What we're saying, again, if we're obligated to do everything no matter what, aren't we assuming there that earthly life is the highest good? Right? But last time I checked, theologically that wasn't true. Right? I mean, if you studied your church history, you know that Augustine had it right, or Augustine, however you wish to say it, had it right when he said that our highest good is what? Our eternal fellowship with God, which makes earthly life what I would call a penultimate good. Okay? Which means that it's not at the top, it's close, but it's not at the top of the pile. I'd be really careful that you don't inadvertently make a theological assumption that if you looked at it rationally, I think you'd be very uncomfortable making. Okay? Earthly life is not the highest good. That's why I think the question, why are we delaying their homecoming, figuratively speaking, has some merit to it. Here's the other one that we get a lot is let's keep going because we believe in a big God who works big miracles. And how can you advocate turning everything off? Where is your faith? I'll never put it quite like that, but it's really tempting to say, if that's what we're going to hope for, then let's really go for it and turn off everything. But most families don't want that. They want medically assisted miracles. And again, last time I looked, God didn't need medicine to work miracles. Now, when our more rational selves take over, and we want to say something that actually has a chance of them hearing, although it's really tempting to say that. I'd be thrown out of the hospital if I said that. But I think maybe the more nuanced answer to that would be that no, God is going to work a miracle. In fact, it's a far bigger one than you're asking for now. What we don't know is just on which side of eternity that miracle is going to be done. In essence, you're asking for the lesser miracle when God's going to work. God's going to heal not only this disease, but all of them when your loved one goes to meet the Lord. And so, yeah, I acknowledge God can work miracles. But in most cases, the miracle He's going to work, not can, but is going to work, is on the other side of eternity. And I think we're much better off viewing this from the paradigm of resurrection and eternity as opposed to God working miracles in the here and now. Yes?
In making those statements, you're presupposing a believer.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And I would say if it's an unbeliever, keep them on life support for another day and get to it. No. Well, the same one as the atheist in the foxhole. But you're right, not as often. Okay? Now, you don't hear this very much, but I'd want to be really careful about applying that idea of suffering being redemptive to the end of life. Because as I read the New Testament, the redemptive value of suffering, for what comes out of James 1, is for character formation, right? And yet, as I read the New Testament, when I meet the Lord, character formation's that's not an issue anymore. It seems to me that the redemptive value of suffering is a this life only phenomenon. And the suffering we're talking about at the end of life, I think is so close to dying that it's really challenging to think about how that could have much redemptive value for this life. And that certainly is not an argument for inflicting suffering on a loved one so that it might have redemptive value. I mean, if we're really consistent with that, then none of us would go to doctors at all, ever. Right? But that's not what we say. What we nuance that more carefully, I think theologically, to say that it's unavoidable suffering, namely on account of your faith, that has redemptive value. And it's unconscionable that you would allow someone to be in pain that can be alleviated at the end of life. That's an assault on their dignity to subject them to that kind of pain. So anyway, the big idea on this is that biblically and theologically, saying enough to medicine is okay. And I think our loved ones, they know a lot more than they let on that their time is up. And sometimes they have to tell us to stop. I will never forget wheeling my father-in-law out of Irvine Medical Center after he had had surgery for a bladder tumor at age 88, which we thought was a good decision at the time. But he had all kinds of complications. He was in the hospital for almost a month. And I remember I'm wheeling him out, and he's weak, and his voice is only strong enough to whisper. And he says, "I got to tell you something." And he whispered in my ear as I'm walking him out. He said, "Don't ever bring me here again." Right? And what he meant by that was that I'm done. I'm done with doctors and hospitals and tests and treatment. I'm done. And though he didn't articulate it quite like this, I think what he meant was that I am content to live out the rest of my days as from God's hand. And I am not going to allow medicine to screw up the end of my life. Because his life went in the toilet once medicine got involved. And I think looking back on it, I'm sorry that we went ahead with that surgery. In retrospect, I think with hindsight being 20/20, that's a different thing. But in retrospect, there was no doubt that the burden outweighed the benefit. And I'm sorry we did that. But from then on, I remember we took him, I told my wife, I said, "We're not taking him anywhere." And she overruled me and took him, his doctor was recommending a chest x-ray. My wife and I both, it took both of us to hold him up by his elbows to get his chest to where they could take a picture of it. I said, "Sally, that's it. No more." And so he had a stroke. And she took him to the hospital. We spent 4 hours in the ER waiting for the neurologist to tell us that he had a stroke and sent him home. Next time he had a stroke, I said, "We are not going anywhere. We're done. Let's respect his wish to be done." And if you think of it, he made a very rational decision. It made total sense why he was done. I think when our loved ones get to the end, they know it. I think our loved ones, sometimes, they're mad at us for delay in their homecoming. I mean, especially for a believer. They want to go be with the Lord. Let them go. Amen? As you can tell, I have really strong feelings about this, having walked with 3 of our parents already, and I know I'm going to have to walk with the 4th one too. And I've just been around so many families who are dealing with it. And in fact, we've had a spate of these recently with families dealing with their kids on this, which is just the most heartbreaking thing you can imagine. You guys, the family, you have no idea how much the families need you guys. They need you, not only to be there with them, but they need you to help them navigate this stuff and to help them make these decisions and give them the courage to say, stop. This last family I was with, they did as their 21-year-old daughter that they turned off life support on. And it was absolutely the right thing. But it nearly killed them to do it. And they needed, they basically needed somebody to hold their hand while they did what they knew was right, but had huge emotional obstacles to that.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.